Hi, I tell very exciting and horrifying stories to everyone. I suggest you subscribe because I post such stories every day. The Mirror Room. Nathan Bell was never superstitious. He was a pragmatic man, grounded in logic and reason, but when his mother passed away, leaving him her old Victorian mansion, he felt a twinge of unease stepping into the house for the first time in decades. The mansion was a relic of the past, filled with antiques, but the most unsettling room was the Mirror Room, a small, dimly lit chamber with mirrors covering every inch of the walls. His mother had always kept the door locked, and Nathan remembered being forbidden from entering as a child. But now the house was his, and curiosity got the better of him. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, feeling a strange chill despite the summer heat outside. The room was dark, save for the weak beam of sunlight that streamed through a crack in the heavy curtains. As his eyes adjusted, he was struck by the sight of his own reflection, or rather, reflections, for the room seemed to multiply his image infinitely, creating an endless tunnel of Nathan Bell staring back at him. For a moment, he felt disoriented, as though he was looking at 100 different versions of himself, each one slightly off. He laughed it off, blaming the illusion on the mirrors. But when he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of his eye. One of his reflections had not turned with him. The first few days passed uneventfully, though Nathan found himself avoiding the Mirror Room. He was busy sorting through his mother's things, discarding old furniture, and trying to decide what to keep. But at night, he would dream of the room, of his reflection standing perfectly still, staring at him with cold, unblinking eyes. He would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. He decided he was being ridiculous. It was just a room, just a series of reflections. There was no reason to be afraid of his own image. To prove it to himself, he went back inside the Mirror Room the following morning. "See," he muttered to himself, forcing a smile as he faced his reflection. "It's just me." But it wasn't just him. His reflection smirked, a small, almost imperceptible curl of the lips that he hadn't made. Nathan's smile faltered, and the smirk grew wider. He stumbled back, knocking over a small table. The sound echoed in the room, but the reflection did not move. It simply watched him, its eyes glinting with something that looked like amusement. Nathan fled the room, slamming the door shut behind him. He told himself it was his imagination, a trick of the light, but the unease gnawed at him. He couldn't stop thinking about the smirk, about the eyes that seemed to follow him. Over the next few days, Nathan tried to avoid the room, but it was as if the house itself was conspiring against him. He would walk down the hallway, only to find himself standing in front of the door without realizing how he got there. He began to notice strange things, shadows that shouldn't be there, footsteps echoing through the halls when he was alone. He heard whispers, too, faint and indistinct, like the soft rustle of fabric against his ear. It wasn't until he saw the bruises that he started to truly panic. They appeared one morning, dark purple marks on his wrists, as if someone had grabbed him tightly. He couldn't remember how he got them, but they hurt to the touch. That night, he locked himself in his bedroom, determined to ignore the Mirror Room. But sleep eluded him. He tossed and turned, his mind racing, until he heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. His heart leapt into his throat. He lay there, frozen, listening. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, slow and deliberate. He squeezed his eyes shut, praying it was a dream, that he was imagining it. The footsteps stopped outside his door. Nathan, a voice whispered, soft and familiar. It was his own voice. He opened his eyes to see his reflection standing at the foot of the bed, grinning. But it wasn't a reflection anymore. It was a man identical to him in every way, except for the eyes. They were cold, empty, and full of malice. What are you?" Nathan choked out, his voice barely a whisper. The reflection tilted its head, almost pityingly. "I am you, Nathan," it said. "The real you. The you that hides in the shadows, that waits for the right moment to take over." Nathan tried to scream, but the reflection lunged at him, pinning him down with inhuman strength. He felt the cold grip on his wrists, the same bruises that had appeared days before. He struggled, but his body felt weak, paralyzed with fear. "Don't fight it," the reflection whispered, its face inches from his. "This is who you've always been. You just didn't want to see it." Nathan felt a coldness wash over him, a darkness creeping into the edges of his vision. The last thing he saw before everything went black was his own face, smiling down at him. The next morning, the neighbors called the police after hearing strange noises from the mansion. They found Nathan sitting in the mirror room, his face expressionless, staring at his reflection. When they asked him what he was doing, he simply smiled and said, "Just looking at myself." But the officers who looked into the mirror swore they saw something else, a flash of a different face, a man trapped behind the glass, screaming silently as he pounded on the surface. The mansion was sold a few months later, and the mirror room was sealed shut. But sometimes, when the light hits the mirrors just right, you can still see Nathan's reflection inside, watching, waiting for someone else to look a little too closely. The whispers in the wall. David Reynolds wasn't a man prone to paranoia. He was a psychologist by profession, grounded in rational thought and science. But when he and his wife, Claire, moved into their new home, a quaint two-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It started with the faint, almost imperceptible sounds at night. At first, he thought it was the old pipes groaning or the wind whistling through the trees outside. But the sounds grew louder, and soon he realized they were coming from inside the walls. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on the other side of the drywall. He mentioned it to Claire, but she just laughed it off, suggesting they call an exterminator. But David knew it wasn't rats or pests. The noise was too deliberate, too measured, almost like a heartbeat. The first time he heard the whisper, he was in his study, reviewing a patient's case files. The voice was faint, like a breath of wind rustling through the leaves, but he could make out the words clearly. "David, help me." He froze, the pen slipping from his fingers. He glanced around the room, half expecting to see someone standing there, but he was alone. The sound had come from the wall behind his desk. He pressed his ear against the cold plaster, straining to listen, but all he heard was the creaking of the house settling. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, the stress of the move playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew he had heard it. Over the next few days, the whispers became more frequent. They always started softly, like the distant murmur of a conversation happening just out of earshot. David couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, pleading. He found himself lingering in certain rooms, pressing his ear against the walls, trying to decipher the voices. Claire caught him doing it once and gave him a concerned look. "David, are you okay?" she asked, her brow furrowed with worry. "You've been acting strange since we moved in." "I'm fine," he lied, forcing a smile. "Just a little tired." He didn't tell her about the whispers. He knew how it would sound, irrational, like he was losing his grip on reality. He was the rational one, the grounded one. But the truth was he was starting to feel like he was losing his mind. One night, he was woken up by the sound of sobbing. It was faint but unmistakable, the quiet, heart-wrenching sobs of a woman in distress. He turned to Claire, but she was fast asleep beside him. The sound wasn't coming from the room, it was coming from inside the wall. He got out of bed, heart pounding, and followed the sound down the hallway. It led him to a small, unused guest room at the end of the hall. The sobbing stopped as soon as he opened the door, replaced by a deafening silence. He flicked on the light and scanned the room, but it was empty. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and pressed his ear against the wall. The whisper was right there, as if someone were speaking directly into his ear. "Please help me. You won't let me go." David stumbled back, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He knew then that this wasn't just his imagination. Someone or something was inside the walls. The next day, David couldn't focus on his work. He kept replaying the voice in his mind, the desperate plea for help. He decided he needed to know more about the house's history. He drove to the town's records office and spent hours combing through old documents and blueprints. What he found made his blood run cold. The house had belonged to a man named Gregory Marsh, a reclusive figure who had lived there with his wife, Eleanor, in the 1950s. Eleanor had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and though there had been rumors of foul play, no evidence was ever found. Marsh had died shortly after, and the house had been sold to new owners. David sat back in his chair, his hands shaking. He knew then who the voice belonged to. It was Eleanor Marsh, and she was trapped in the walls of the house, crying out for help. He rushed home, his mind racing. He couldn't explain it, didn't understand it, but he knew he had to do something. He grabbed a hammer from the toolbox in the garage and went straight to the guest room. He stood there, listening to the faint whispers, the pleading voice of the woman trapped inside. "Hold on," he said aloud. "I'm going to get you out." He swung the hammer at the wall, the plaster crumbling under the force of the blow. He kept hitting it, pulling away chunks of drywall until a small hole appeared. He shone his flashlight into the darkness, expecting to see old pipes or insulation. But instead he saw a face. It was a woman's face, pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with terror. Her mouth moved soundlessly, forming the words, "Help me." David screamed, stumbling back, dropping the flashlight. The room plunged into darkness, but he could still see her, illuminated by the dim light from the hallway. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Claire standing in the doorway, her face twisted in confusion. "David, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice rising in panic. "There's someone in the wall," he shouted, pointing frantically. "It's her. It's Eleanor." Claire's expression softened, her eyes filling with pity. "David," she said gently, "there's no one there." He turned back to the wall, but the face was gone. The hole he had made was empty, just splintered wood and darkness. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. Had he imagined it? "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "I saw her. I heard her." Claire stepped closer, taking the hammer from his hands. "David, you need help," she whispered. "You're not well." He looked into her eyes and saw it then, a flicker of something dark and familiar. The same look he had seen in the face of the woman in the wall. He realized with a sickening jolt that the whispers had stopped. The house was silent, and then Claire smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "You've heard them too, haven't you?" she said softly. "The whispers." David's heart raced. What are you talking about? She leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. He won't let us go, David. We're all trapped here, you and me, just like Eleanor. Before he could react, she shoved him hard. He fell backwards into the wall, the splintered wood giving way. He felt himself falling, tumbling into a narrow, dark space, and then the wall closed up behind him with a deafening thud. He screamed, pounding his fists against the wood, but no sound escaped. He could see Claire standing there, her face expressionless, staring at the spot where he had disappeared. "Good night, David," she said, turning off the light. The house was sold again a few months later. The new owners never noticed the faint, rhythmic tapping that echoed through the walls at night. They dismissed it as old pipes or the wind. But if you stand in the guest room late at night and press your ear against the wall, you might hear a whisper, "Please help me," and then silence. Asterisk, asterisk, the black door, asterisk, asterisk. Dr. Emma Caldwell was a respected psychiatrist, known for her innovative work with patients suffering from severe trauma and dissociative disorders. She had dedicated her life to helping others confront their fears, but she was about to face a fear she couldn't rationalize, a terror that would test the very limits of her sanity. It began with the arrival of a new patient, Daniel Hale. Daniel was different from any patient she had ever encountered. He was brought in by the police after being found wandering the streets, disoriented and babbling incoherently about the black door. He had no identification, no family, and no memory of who he was. His only constant was his terror of the black door, which he described in fragments, as though he couldn't bear to fully remember it. "It's there," he would whisper, eyes darting to the corner of the room. "Always watching, always waiting. I can't escape it." Emma was intrigued, but also wary. She had seen severe cases of psychosis before, but there was something different about Daniel's fear. It wasn't the delusional paranoia she was used to. It felt real. She decided to start a series of intensive therapy sessions, hoping to unlock the source of his trauma. What she didn't realize was that by doing so, she was opening a door that should have remained closed. The first few sessions were uneventful. Daniel was reluctant to talk, often falling into long silences or staring at the far corner of the room, his face twisted in an expression of raw terror. Emma noticed that he avoided looking directly at her office door, glancing at it only briefly before shuddering and looking away. "Tell me about the black door," she asked during their third session, keeping her voice calm and steady. Daniel's entire body tensed, and he began to rock back and forth, muttering under his breath. "It's there. It's there. I can't escape it." Emma leaned forward. "Where is it, Daniel? What does it look like?" He stopped rocking and met her gaze, his eyes wide and filled with a hollow, haunted look. "You don't want to see it," he whispered. "It's not a door. It's a mouth." Emma felt a chill run down her spine, but she pushed on. "What happens if you open it?" Daniel's face contorted in fear. "You don't open it," he hissed. "It opens for you." That night, Emma couldn't sleep. The image of the black door lingered in her mind, a dark shape that seemed to loom in the shadows of her bedroom. She told herself it was just her imagination, that she was letting her patient's fears influence her thoughts. But as she lay there in the dark, she heard a faint creaking sound, like the hinge of an old, heavy door. She sat up, her heart pounding. The room was silent now, but the sound had been so real. She got up, checking the hallway, the front door, the windows. Everything was locked and secure. She went back to bed, telling herself she was being ridiculous. It was just a dream, a trick of the mind. But as she drifted off to sleep, she heard it again, the slow, deliberate creak of a door opening. The next day, she confronted Daniel with more urgency. "This black door," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Why do you think it's real?" Daniel looked at her, his eyes dull and lifeless. "Because I've seen it," he said simply. "And so have you." Emma felt a jolt of fear. "What do you mean?" "I haven't seen anything." He shook his head. "Not yet, but you will. It's chosen you now. It shows itself to those who try to understand it. It feeds on curiosity." She wanted to dismiss it as more of his delusional rambling, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled deep in her gut. There was something about the way he said it, the certainty in his voice, that made her skin crawl. That night, as she locked up her office, she hesitated in front of her door. The hallway was dark and empty, but she felt a presence, a weight pressing against her back, as though something were standing directly behind her. She turned quickly, but there was nothing there. She took a deep breath and pushed the door closed. But just as it clicked shut, she heard it, the sound of a door creaking open, echoing softly through the empty hallway. Emma's hands shook as she locked the door, her keys slipping from her fingers. She hurried to her car, glancing back only once to see the dark outline of a door that hadn't been there before, standing at the end of the hall. It was tall, impossibly black, and though it was closed, she could feel it watching her. The next day, she found Daniel's bed empty. The nurses said he had vanished during the night, despite the locked doors and the cameras that showed no sign of him leaving. His belongings were still there, including a notebook he had been scribbling in during his stay. Emma took it back to her office, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. Most of it was nonsense, scribbles, drawings of eyes, words scrawled in a frenzied hand. But the last page caught her attention. It was blank, except for a single sentence written in neat, precise script. Asterisk, asterisk, the door is open now. Emma felt a wave of dizziness, a creeping cold spreading through her limbs. She looked up and froze. The door to her office, which she had locked minutes ago, was now ajar. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as she approached it. The hallway beyond was dark, far darker than it should have been, as though the light had been swallowed up by the shadows. She peered through the crack in the door, and there it was, the black door. It was exactly as Daniel had described. Not just a door, but a gaping maw, an impossibly dark void that seemed to pulse and breathe. It was watching her, she realized, and she could feel its hunger, a deep, gnawing emptiness that tugged at her mind. She backed away, her head spinning. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself. "It's just a hallucination. It's not real." But the door creaked open wider, and she heard the sound of footsteps approaching from the darkness beyond. Slow, deliberate footsteps that echoed through her mind. "You shouldn't have opened it," a voice whispered, echoing Daniel's words. Now it's too late. The door slammed shut, and she was alone again in her office, the sunlight streaming through the windows as if nothing had happened. But she knew she wasn't alone. She could feel it now, a presence behind the walls, beneath the floor, inside her own mind. The black door had opened, and it wasn't going to close again. Emma disappeared 2 weeks later. Her office was found in disarray, the desk overturned, papers scattered everywhere. The last thing she wrote was a single sentence, scrawled across the wall in her own blood. "Do not look for the door." The hospital tried to cover it up, calling it a tragic case of a mental breakdown. But the nurses still whisper about the black door, and sometimes late at night, they hear it creaking open, just out of sight. And those who are unlucky enough to look directly at it are never seen again.